and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Global financial policymakers convened this week for the springtime meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Ahead of the meetings, the IMF chief urged governments to invest in greener and smarter economies for a post-COVID recovery.
A green investment push can lift up growth by 0.7% over the next 15 years and create millions of green jobs.
With the world moving toward a net zero future, green finance is poised to be a long-term sustainable solution to climate change. According to the World Bank, it has so far issued over 160 green bonds in 22 currencies, nearly $15 billion, to finance climate resilient growth. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, also known as AIIB, also set a target of ensuring 50% of its overall financing by 2025 will be for green finance. So what actions can we expect from China? What will it take to shape a resilient recovery that works for the people and the planet? And how will China work with the others toward those goals? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on the green finance and climate change in New York, we are joined by Jeffrey Sachs, professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development from Columbia University. In London, we are joined by ISABEL, HILTON, CEO and editor of ChinaDialogue.net. And in London, Bob Ward, Policy and Communications Director with Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Last but not least, in Guangzhou, Qi Ye, Professor of Public Policy for Tsinghua University and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. This is such a strong panel. Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Want to start by asking Professor Sachs, this week, during the annual session of the World Bank and the IMF, the issue of climate change is certainly to be well discussed. How do you think the financial world and the development issues could contribute to the overall discussion?
We're definitely past the tipping point now. There's a lot of momentum for a major energy transformation worldwide. All of the major economies are signing up to the idea of decarbonization by mid-century. China has announced decarbonization by no later than 2060, Japan and Korea by 2050, the European Union by 2050, the UK by 2050, President Biden by 2050. This is a big change, and investors have lost a lot of money investing in fossil fuels during the past decade. They finally woke up to reality. It took them a lot of time, but I think there is a significant change underway, and I'm sure that at the IMF World Bank meetings there will be talk about what is also needed, much more public financing for the energy transformation.
Right. Now, Professor Qi, if you think about the World Bank and the IMF, the money that they have in their hands for development issues could be quite limited. Meanwhile, there is a lot of debate about the debt issue, debt trap among the developing countries. Some say it's not necessarily the real issue, but rather a man-made issue. Professor Qi, how much do you think, the World Bank and the IMF meetings this time and the discussion related to it could really contribute to the real discussion of climate change and measures related to it?
Ever since the late last year, I think the world now is developing a new consensus, like Professor Sachs just mentioned. All major economies now have either announced or about to announce their goal for carbon neutrality.
Right.
And the world now, depending on how you count it, 80 to 120 countries now either planning or have already developed their goal for carbon neutrality. I think this is a major consensus with IMF and the World Bank joining force and to indicate a major shift of financing of financial resources into this endeavor for carbon neutrality. I think that that's a very, very big signal that the business world should receive. In fact, the finance world, that they are operating on this something called shared belief, right? When the whole society now develop a shared belief, then the money and the other resources will pour in. I think that I hope this represent a major shift.
There are very different standards about green finance and very different ways of understanding it worldwide.
The financial system is moving very quickly away from funding for unsustainable investments and then particularly fossil fuels. Coal these days is a rather foolish investment, likely that you will lose your money if you invest in fossil fuels. But there is a lot of discussion about what are the appropriate standards or taxonomies that you should use in order to judge the quality of the investments. Now, I think it's going to take a bit of time to sort this all out, but I think it's fairly clear that you shouldn't be investing in fossil fuels. You want to be investing in things that have a future. That's renewable energy, that's electric vehicles. It's all the things that we can see are being developed. And I think that this discussion about the standards is really just part of that transition that is happening very, very quickly, both on the private side and on the public finance side.
The U.S. now committed to the Paris Accord, but with the politics change going on in the U.S. from the federal level, there could be policy switch again 4 years from now. Secondly, there is also a lot of different understanding about what it means at a national level in terms of carbon zero and carbon neutrality, particularly when you have the developing countries that are in a very different stage of development compared to the developed economies. So how do you understand, all of these complex issues?
Well, we do have a fairly complicated picture if you take a global view. As far as the US going back again into an anti-climate position, I think in 4 years' time that will look a lot less likely, partly because of the shifts that we've been hearing about, that it just makes much less sense. The market is killing coal. It makes much less sense to invest in fossil fuels than it did even 5 years ago. Money will go where the profit is, and increasingly that is in renewables. So we see this accelerating push into renewables, and every report that's come out in the last 6 months has emphasized this, including the IEA's report. So I think that just the market forces will be very much against the kind of switch that we saw under Donald Trump. And even if that were to happen at a federal level, at a state and city level in the United States, I think we'd still see momentum growing, again, because it makes sense.
Yeah.
As far as emerging economies go, I mean, the biggest emerging economy that hasn't declared yet a carbon neutrality target is India. There is some expectation that it might, but even if it doesn't, again, if you look at the pattern of investment in India, which was expected to build a lot of new coal, that has fallen away dramatically, and India is now expected to cut its coal investments by around 84%, which is big. And there will be a corresponding ramp up of solar, which is the big bet that India is making.
Right.
So that even in emerging economies, and you see actually quite a lot of smaller economies that are doing rather better in terms of carbon neutrality than the big ones. Uruguay, Costa Rica, there are any number of really positive examples out there.
Okay.
So I think the momentum is with it.
Professor Sachs, do you see much chance that China and the U.S. could really cooperate on climate change?
Well, there is a common interest. The two largest emitters in the world with combined emissions of more than 40% of the total greenhouse gases. We have a lot of work to do. I think analyzing the ways forward together, proposing expanded models for multilateral development bank financing of the transition around the world, helping to recapitalize these banks with more lending power these are very practical areas where the U.S. and China should be working together. And I know that that is the intention of the U.S., even though the rhetoric has been not to my liking in recent weeks. I think there is a lot of scope for cooperation, and I hope in the next few weeks with the IMF World Bank meetings, with the meeting that President Biden has called, and so forth, that opportunity for cooperation will come to the forefront. There's just been too much negative and too much bickering, and we really need the cooperation.
Right. Professor Shi, we heard a lot from the Special Envoy on Climate Change, Mr. Kerry, talking about cooperation with China. And yet we heard from the foreign policy decision makers inside the U.S., for example, from the Secretary of State and from the National Security Advisor, mainly it's more words about competition and even rivalry. So there seems to be very different pages that different leaders in the administration are on.
I think that common goal, that's carbon neutrality one, is a major one, right? President Biden made it quite clear, 2050, this some way matches our 2060 carbon neutrality. And in order to achieve this common goal of carbon neutrality, there are many other things to do. Right now, it is much harder than a couple of years ago when we talk about cooperation on technology and financing, but still there are opportunities. Financing in particular, right? This is one area that China has announced to put in a lot of money, and the U.S. $2.3 trillion for infrastructure, with a major share of that into green financing to finance the green growth. Technology is certainly one area we should work together, but it's pretty hard right now.
We see different timetable about the carbon zero and carbon neutrality. However, there were people that were trying to push the developing country also to claim 2050 as the carbon neutrality time.
If politicians set out a target, it gives a clear signal to the private sector about the pace and the direction. And so these are important. China has a tremendous challenge on its hands now, that if it wants to go from peaking in, say, 2030 to carbon neutrality in 2060, that's a period of only 30 years. That's going to be a real challenge. Many other countries around the world peaked a long time ago, particularly in Europe. The UK peaked its emissions in the 1970s. So it would make sense for China to accelerate. But I think what will drive this more than anything else is an understanding that the best way of ensuring sustainable growth over the long term is by investing in all the technologies and the business models and methods that actually move you away from a reliance on fossil fuels. And I think that understanding now that you can develop and grow in a much cleaner and smarter way, and that it's good for your economy, will drive that transition much more quickly than even the target.
We've been hearing this for a long time. Every country also have their own circumstances. So as you said, the European countries, some of them already peaked during the 1970s and 80s, and therefore the next target will be much easier. But Ms. Hilton, you've been doing research about China and some Asian countries. 2060, China already have to put enormous amount of efforts in order to achieve.
Yes, that's true. In all of these long-term targets, the sooner you start, the less steep the slope you have to climb. And the concern about China's target, and in particular in the light of the 14th five-year plan, which we've just seen published, is that leaving the major effort till after 2030 is going to make it much harder after 2030. You know, every country is different. And in, you know, going back to your question of how China and the United States could cooperate, for example, one would be to have a common framework for assistance to emerging economies, to developing economies, to help them avoid going down a carbon heavy pathway, which has been the traditional pathway, the fast route of development, which we can no longer afford. Help them skip that stage and go straight to an energy system for the 21st century, for example. Agreeing common development policies and common standards there would make an enormous difference, both to those emerging economies and to global emissions. So there are lots of ways now that, for example, since China has made renewables effectively cheaper than fossil fuels in many geographies, that opens up lots of opportunities for collaboration if we could just have the imagination to seize them.
I think it's going to go faster than we think because essentially the technologies have gotten a lot better. China has also made a huge advance. Storage has come down in costs, so the intermittency of renewable energy is not such a problem as it was perceived to be before. The fact of the matter is we have to watch not only what we think are our own economic timetables, but nature's timetable as well. We're in a very dangerous situation globally. We're close to tipping points of nature in terms of massive rise of sea levels because of the destruction of the ice sheets, the change of the ocean circulation. And that's why 2050 is really a late date. I believe that China will decarbonize well before 2060 because China does everything very fast and very effectively. And I think 2050 will prove to be an absolutely manageable target.
You are, Professor Sachs, much more confident about that goal that you set than most of the Chinese policymakers. We're looking at the numbers right now as we speak. Professor Qi,
I'm a big believer in China's capacity, so I think that China will move very fast in this.
Well, encouragement is certainly needed, but also looking into reality is also needed. Let me go to Professor Qi also for that question.
I share the optimism of Professor Sachs about the future trend. I just want to clarify the 2060 versus 2050 target most developed countries have identified. We need to put it in a context. You know, the United Nations Environmental Program regularly publish the so-called gap analysis report. And this gap analysis is based on some assumptions, the equity and the capacity and so on and so forth. If you put this 2060 target China has announced into that context, you realize this is a trajectory for the consistent to the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a really ambitious based on the UN environment analytical framework. So this is very, very significant. Just like Ms. Ward just mentioned, you know, from peak to neutrality, and EU takes 60 years, US 45 years, UK 80 years, and China has to get this done by 30 years. This means tremendous effort and challenges. You're talking about the jobs and the people who are now in the sector, fossil fuel sector. There are many of them. 3 million people in the coal-fired power plant, for instance. Not a lot of people we need to think about. And there are a lot of investment that will necessarily become stranded asset.
There's one elephant in the room that we haven't talked about. That is how much trust really is there in our world when the geopolitics has become such a big phenomenon. Whether we're going to see that also poisoning the atmosphere of cooperation for climate change, we do not know. How much confidence do you have, Professor Sachs?
I feel a lot better now than I did before the November 2020 election. We had a very nutty president, a very dangerous person. I think we got beyond that, and I think the chance for rational cooperation among all the major economies is vastly, vastly greater now.
Professor, if I could just interrupt here, because it has to be said, you know, since the new administration coming into power, many of the things that the earlier administration did, for example, sanctions and things like that, have not moved away. What about the strategic relationship between China and the United States? Whether that's improved or not, will that help in the climate change cooperation, if there were any?
What gives me confidence is that this new administration in the U.S. is far more rational. It is rational. It is forward-looking. It is in the right direction on this issue. So if you ask me, of course, I read the same headlines, hear the same speeches and so on, but I am more optimistic.
I'm very encouraged by seeing John Kerry and Xie Jinhua back in harness, because this is, you know, a very positive personal relationship. It is going to take all of that chemistry to keep things on track, however, because as you say, there are serious risks here in the geopolitical configuration. And I think we've already seen that in terms of a certain caution in energy security, which we've seen again in the 14th five-year plan. Security was very much a dominant theme, and you know, the idea that we're still building coal because that provides security in one sense, but it's antithetical to climate security in another. So we can already see these tensions. I think that lines of communication are going to be very important as we go forward, because, for example, the European Union, which has the largest and most progressive climate strategy, is talking about carbon border tax adjustments. So that is, you know, how do you protect your own industries as you make this transition from carbon leakage? And there will be, by the end of the year, I'm pretty sure, a system going into place in Europe of tariffs against high carbon goods. Now, in order to manage that without more disharmony, we are going to have to keep these lines of communication going and see if we can act in concert with each other on common standards so that we reinforce cooperation instead of blowing it up.
If there's one thing we should have learned from the pandemic, is that our futures are all interconnected, and that the only way forward is through cooperation. You cannot have a world in which there is prosperity and well-being for everyone by trying to close yourself off. There has to be this cooperation in order for us all to make progress. And I think that climate change, infectious disease, and biodiversity loss are huge global challenges, and we all have to work together. And I would hope that the governments of the United States, of China, of Europe, of all governments understand that we have to work together to tackle these, because as the pandemic has shown, if one country is not safe, then we're all exposed to the same risk. We all have to work together.
We have to realize trade, geopolitics, and climate change are working in very different scale and scope. Right? The climate change will be with us for a long time, and cooperation is a must for all of us. I think we have developed a consensus right now. We should capitalize on our consensus, and just, you know, for many other issues, including this border adjustment tax that Isabel just mentioned. I mean, they're not controversial. They're not helping, right? Let's just capitalize on our carbon neutrality consensus and build upon that, and develop a common goal and common program.
I think we really need to borrow the sense of optimism, the sense of consensus, camaraderie, and the sense of you know, common sense from this conversation, from every one of the four of you. Thank you so much for your contribution. Jeffrey Sachs, Isabel Hilton, Bob Ward, last but not least, Qi Ye. Really appreciate it. Thank you.